Our teacher is Greg Scheer, Music Associate at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. His writings include his new book, Essential Worship, a handbook for leaders, and The Art of Worship, as well as contributions to Reformed Worship, Worship Leader, and various other publications. Greg has led worship and worked with teams in the local church and at conferences around the world. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Greg for his teaching. Thanks, Greg.
Welcome, everybody. If I can figure out how to do this, I will now share my, hold on. I'm going to share my screen. Yes, that's what I'm going to do. Okay. I'm going to give you some notes here. There we go. That should be working. The absolutely most important things to know about leading worship teams. So this is taken in part from my book, The Art of Worship. And so we're going to take 250 pages of The Art of Worship, or what I often do in 6 hours when I lead workshops in local churches and conferences, and we're going to condense it down to 25 minutes, which is probably foolhardy, but we're going to give it a try. And so we'll just get right to things. So basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to outline some of the things that I have found to be the most important things, the things that are going to trip you up, and I've seen trip up worship teams over and over again and trip up worship team leaders. So what I'll do is I'll touch on a number of areas, and then, as Diane said, you can just ask any questions that you have. You just be thinking of those questions, and then I can address more specifically the needs of this particular group. So let's get going. You have one job. I'm sure you've heard people say that. You had one job. And so when you are a worship leader, you have one job, and that's to help the congregation sing. Okay, so never forget that. We always need to keep coming back to that. We often talk about how good our band sounds, and do they have good stage presence, and any number of things like that. Those are all important. But ultimately, what you do when you lead a worship team, when you're on a worship team, is you help the congregation sing. So let's not forget that. What is a worship team? They're called many things: praise team, praise bands, worship teams. But no matter how you slice it, it is essentially a pop band that leads songs in a local church. And so I have sliced this pop band into something I call the praise pyramid. And so, and it's a pyramid for a specific reason. The widest part at the bottom is the kind of foundational part that other things rest on. So let me just unpack this so that we understand what we're talking about. So let's look. Let's start with a voice. Sure, let's start with a voice. So the voice is in the upper quadrant there. Now the interesting thing about the voice, when I say the voice, talking about worship team, you probably think about the vocalists on the worship team. And that is only true in part. The thing, once again, we have to come back to, what is your one job? It's to lead the congregation. So the thing about the worship team that is unusual in the larger sense of pop music and all the things that it comes from is that all of the musicians are not there to support a lead singer. All the musicians there are to support the congregation. So in a very real sense, at rehearsal, you should almost have a hole where the vocals are supposed to go, and the congregation will fill in that hole on Sunday morning. Now, that doesn't mean that your vocalists are unimportant. It just means that we need to keep in mind that our pyramid is supporting the voice of the congregation. So let's move down from the voice. The chords. Piano and guitar tend to provide the harmonic foundation of the praise team or the worship team, and they tend to work in tandem. Often a song is more piano driven or is more guitar driven, and that foundation is right there underneath the voice. Now you'll see what can happen if we were to slice off the bottom part, the rhythm part. We could still have an effective worship team. Okay, the voice would still have something to rest on in this praise pyramid. But if you have a more full worship team, then you can go that extra layer, and then you have the rhythm section, which is the drums and the bass. And so the drums and the bass, they provide a further foundation underneath what the harmonic, the chords instruments are doing. And they provide the very low end and the real rhythmic foundation. Now, if you can see it, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but at the very top of the pyramid is what I call frou-frou. So frou-frou is kind of the icing on the cake. And I call it frou-frou to remind us that it really is not completely necessary, in the sense that even though these things, so for instance, vocal harmonies, maybe a guitar solo, some cool, string part, all of those kinds of things are great and they can make the music sound more exciting. But if we took those away, the pyramid would still stand, okay? So that's the worship team pyramid. Now let's look at the various slices of this pyramid, the voice. So we come back to, once again, what is your one job? So I have to remind my vocalists all the time of this, that they are not there to sing, they are there to help the congregation sing. And this is very, very important. So for example, if you're on a worship team with me, I will always be telling you to back away from the microphone. I'll say your one job is to get the congregation singing. Once they start singing the line, just back up from the mic and enjoy the sound of the congregation. Your work is done and it sounds beautiful, just enjoy it. So keep your focus on that rather than on how good your vocals sound and all those kinds of things. I've seen so many worship teams invest hours and hours into these tiny intricate details of their vocalists or of the arrangement of the song, and when they go to do it on a Sunday morning, the congregation just can't completely sing because they haven't focused on that one thing. So if you are a vocalist on a worship team and you are trying to help out a congregation by your vocal leadership, what are the things to remember? First of all, you are conducting and instructing the congregation. So when I say conduct, I don't mean conduct as in conduct with your hands, although you could, I guess, at various points do something like that. But more importantly is you're trying to conduct the congregation. You're trying to give them instructions and cues as to when to sing. We've all been in a service where a new verse comes up. There's a little interlude, a musical interlude, and then a new verse comes up, and the singers on the praise team look just as surprised as the congregation that the verse has started. And so the verse starts and they all go, and they get up to their microphone and start singing. And at that point, it's too late. And I always tell my singers, you have to be a measure ahead, right? You have to be ready a measure ahead, and you catch the eyes of the other singers and the musicians. Okay, we all know that the verse is coming up right here, and then you just breathe with the congregation. La, and everybody knows exactly where I'm going because I've taken the breath, I've given them a cue to say, that's where it is right there. If you want to use your hand and indicate that this is the time to do it, that's fine, whatever you're comfortable with. And then instructions, sometimes those are verbal instructions, like let's sing the chorus again. If you're more in a black gospel setting, you might just say, lift his name higher, and everybody knows that you're going to modulate up and sing the chorus again. So it all depends on your congregation and the context. But basically, you want to build a relationship with the congregation where they trust you for everything they need to sing. The more you give them unclear cues, the less they trust you and the less willing they will be to sing. So build that relationship over time, okay? Some things that will help your vocalist. Avoid soloistic singing. So there's what I call a vanilla way to sing, and then there's a solo way to sing. What we're really looking here for, we're not looking for American Idol. We're looking for the vanilla way to sing. Now, it's kind of boring to sing with a vanilla tone. You're not doing swoops and scoops and little trills between notes. So it's not quite as fun to sing as it is when you're singing a solo. But that's just what the congregation needs. The more doodads that you put on top of the melody, the more it obscures the melody. The less people understand what the melody actually is. Okay, now of course this depends entirely on your context. Sometimes that's just expected, okay? But I usually tell my vocalists, look, if you want to show off your vocals, I encourage you to do that, but do it somewhere else. Do it karaoke night, join a band, try out for American Idol, do it. That's great, and we'll all go and watch you. But on Sunday morning, just keep a nice vanilla tone, make sure the melody is completely clear. Don't overuse harmonies. And this sounds like I'm asking you to dumb down your music. In a sense, I am. There are people who only sing harmonies, and there are worship teams that spend so much time on harmonies that you can't hear where the melody is. So make sure, especially when you're teaching a song, make sure that the melody is very, very clear. Use the harmonies as a way to highlight parts of the song and make it, kind of embroider it as the song goes on. But don't do it right up front. Make sure the congregation is completely on board and really singing strongly before you do that. Learn to use microphones. I don't know how many times I've seen this. You have 4 people who, you know, I'm going to work with the church, and I'm told we've got 4 really great singers. And they are really great singers. But each one of them has a different relationship to the mic. One is eating it, and that's all you can hear is just the sound of their lips popping against the microphone. Another one is 2 feet back from it. They're just petrified of the microphone and won't get near it. The sound person can't mix that. So make sure that you work in the same way that your instrumentalists practice scales and all those kinds of skills. You need to get your vocalists to learn how to use a microphone well, okay? All right, another thing, sing good songs. So if we want our congregation to sing, if that's our focus, is to really get a congregation singing, sing good songs. And I think that this is one of the most important things. I've seen over and over again, churches, they'll chase the latest trend, they'll sing whatever comes along, they'll be very non-critical about what they sing, and so they'll just sing anything that comes down the pike, and eventually people check out because they just say, I really can't sing this with my whole heart. So what do you want to find? You want to find songs with good theology, solid theology, on a wide range of themes. My goal, and we could talk for 2 hours just on this theme, but basically, you want to be able to sing the whole of the Christian life, the whole biblical witness. So if you're not singing psalms, if you're not singing songs about all the persons of the Trinity, if you're not singing about missions, if you're not singing about sin and redemption, right? If you find yourself only singing generic praise songs, for example, which is a really common thing, then I think that there's something wrong. So you want to find a wide range of themes. Sing in comfortable ranges. It is no surprise that plenty of modern singers, it tends to be that men sing very high, the Chris Tomlin effect, and it tends to be that women soloists sing very low. So somewhere in between is where a congregation is. Find comfortable ranges for your congregations. And music that's appropriate for your congregation and your musicians. I don't know how many times I've heard an organist try to lead How Great Is Our God, and it just doesn't work. So know your congregation, know what your musicians can do. If you don't have a drum set, don't try to do Hillsong Young and Free. It's just not going to work for you. So be appropriate with what you choose. All right, now we get into the instruments of the band, and I'll just touch on a couple things, and then you can ask any questions that that come up as we talk about these things. So the thing that we need to be careful about is when we're talking about instruments on a worship team, we're talking about the same things, but we're talking about them being used in different ways. So your garden variety musician, classically trained musician, or hymn trained musician is used to practicing by themselves and doing everything. Okay, so they do the harmony, they do the bass line, they do the melody, they do it all, and they go to church and it sounds great, and that's fantastic. You should have that skill. But when you play with the band, it's a very different kind of skill. So whether you're doing the playing or whether you are leading someone who is playing piano on a praise team, on a worship team. You want to encourage them to explore band playing rather than solo playing. And it just simply means that you have other people all around you playing. You don't need to do everything anymore. In fact, it would be downright inhospitable of you to try to play everything. You'd be all in everybody else's junk. So first thing is play less. Think of it this way. If every song has 100% music and you play 100% of the instrumental accompaniment when you're on your own as a soloist, when you're in a band of 4 people, you should play 25%. Okay, leave space for everybody else. Some specific ways to do that: reduce the left hand. You pianists, you know that octave hook in your left hand. It's like you might as well just have it cemented down, because you never change it, I'm sure. You don't need those 2 octaves anymore. If you have a bass player with you, stay out of the bass player's territory and just restrict more to the middle. So then don't be afraid of using the upper octave. So I talk about reducing the left hand because that's where the bass is. But often on the upper end of the piano is a really good sonic territory to explore, which is unused by any of the other rhythm instruments of the worship team. So your guitar is mainly a middle range instrument. So if you jump up to the top sometimes, that's a really nice way to do it. Use a variety of ranges and patterns. So just really explore, and I think this is kind of one of the fun things about the piano in the worship team, is that you can explore all sorts of different ways to do it. You don't have to arpeggiate each time. You can sometimes just hit a chord on the downbeat, chon, 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 or you can do 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 do. That's fine. Or you can do something, double the melody up in the octave. There are all sorts of things you can do. I talked about this a little bit in The Art of Worship. I give some examples of things you can do. And then listen to the musicians around you. There's nothing worse than a musician that just plows ahead regardless of what's happening around him. So a musician who listens, they're worth their weight in gold. So be a pianist or work with your pianist so that they will listen to what's happening. If the bass is filling up the bottom end, you don't need to jump all in that. If there's a hole where the guitar is now just hitting downbeats, now you can arpeggiate. So fill in spots that are unused elsewhere. The guitar. The guitar, often worship leaders are, or worship directors, whatever you want to call them, are pianists, and they just do not understand the guitar. And we don't have the time to go into everything about the guitar, but I will tell you a couple things that will make you and your guitarist very happy. So first thing to remember is there are what's called open chords, and that means that there are open notes ringing in the chord, and then there are bar chords, which are you put your finger down and you have to hold down all of the strings. Now, most of your guitarists will be playing a steel string acoustic guitar, and it takes quite a bit of muscle to push all the strings down. It's much easier to play open chords. Your open chords are things like G, E minor, A minor, C, D, those kinds of chords. And they have open notes in them ringing, and they sound really good. And I wish, I could just take my guitar off the wall here, but I won't. You'll just have to try this out, or ask your friendly local guitarist to show this for you. Now, why is this important? If you choose a song in the key of E flat, it's perfectly fine. If you're a pianist, that's no problem at all. But if you're a guitarist, that's a big deal. It won't sound good, and it'll kill your hand. So you'll have tendonitis by the time the song is done. So what you need to do is you need to use a capo. And a capo, what that does is it transposes the instrument. So instead of being tuned with open E, now you put it on the first fret and it's open F. All right. And once again, I go into this in further detail in The Art of Worship, so you can read more about it there. But just know that when your guitarist complains about the keys of songs, they're not actually just jerking you around, and they're not actually just being lazy. They really do need your help. So what you need to do as a leader, you need to know what keys are guitar friendly, and then you need to make sure that you transpose them for your guitarist, so that when your guitarist shows up, he or she has the chords written out in a capo key, like a transposed key. Strumming versus picking. I'll just briefly mention that these are the two basic timbres that you get with the guitar. The strumming is just back and forth, kind of washboard kind of sound. And then the picking could be finger picking, which is more of a harp kind of sound. It can also be done with a pick called finger picking, or a flat picking, and that's a little bit of a sharper sound, but the same kind of thing, harp-like kind of sound. Now, people often say guitar, and they're talking about the, they think they're talking about the same thing, but the electric guitar is a very different sound. So, and I won't go into this too much right now, but think of it as organ and piano. If you said, oh, we just want keyboard here, and you didn't specify whether you wanted organ or piano, it would be a very, very different sound depending on what you chose, right? It's the same thing with electric and acoustic. Acoustic is a kind of standard bread and butter sound of the praise team. The electric guitar is frequently used, but less frequently used. If you have one instrument, it tends to be that it's just the acoustic guitar. So just understand that. You don't want an electric guitarist strumming along with an acoustic guitarist, because it's going to sound like a mess. And that's what synchronizing the guitars is all about, is if you have more than one guitar, they need to find, just like a pianist and guitarist need to find their own territory, the acoustic and the electric need to find their own things to do. Bass, which is my instrument, so it's the best instrument. So the bass is the lowest of low. It's the subwoofer of the band. And this is really the only sound that should be the bass drum and the bass guitar should be the two sounds that kind of move you in your gut, okay? And this is why the pianist needs to stay out of that range, is because it just will muddy it if you have too much down there. Important things to remember. Your bass and your bass drum work in tandem all the time. If your bass guitarist and the bass drum of the drum set are in conflict, if their rhythms are slightly different, it produces a foundation that is very, very shaky. For bassists, the big things are don't overplay and don't over-amplify. Sometimes we don't hear the problems that a bass is making because they're so low that we tend to ignore them. They're not as abrasive as, say, a guitar, electric guitar feeding back. But often a bassist can be overplaying and just making a lot of mud in the low end, or could just be too loud. And you don't hear it as too loud because you're feeling it more than hearing it, but it just creates a lot of mess in the low end. Drums. I wish I could just teach you how to drum tonight, but it would be a little bit awkward. So let me just say a couple things, if you are not a drum player, how to communicate and understand drums. First thing to remember is the bass drum and the snare form the backbone of the groove. So for example, right? I do that and you say, oh, that's a certain kind of groove, okay? Now when I say how to communicate with drummers, I just gave you an example. You don't have to say, why don't you try 8 notes on the cymbal there? Just go, right? And then you just kind of give them a beat, and then the drummer will go, oh, I know what you want. You want kind of a funk thing, and then they'll go into it. So I don't know how many times I've done boom boom chap stuff with a drummer, and they know exactly what I'm talking about. We'll probably get some questions about this. I'll just touch on it briefly. Volume is a big deal for drummers and for praise teams as well, because you have to mix your sound to go up to the loudest acoustic instrument. You understand what I mean? If the loudest instrument in the room is the piano, then we only have to go to that level. But the drums are almost necessarily going to be louder. So now we have to boost the piano and the vocalist and everybody else. And that's why we have these volume wars sometimes, is that the drums are so loud that we have to boost everything else up to hear it. And now the overall volume gets louder and louder. Then we have feedback problems and all those kinds of things. Some ways you can deal with that: you can put an acoustic shell around the drum set. I am not a huge fan of that because it often will take away the direct sound of the drums, but you still have the sound shooting up into the air. I prefer, instead of using an acoustic shell, just to get a very small drum set. Drum sets make different amounts of volume. So a lot of times a church buys a drum set that their drummer has recommended, and their drummer is a metalhead and gets a big old bass drum, and everything's big, makes a lot of sound. It's made for a rock band. It's overwhelming for a church. But if you get more of a small kind of a jazz style set with a small bass drum, pretty tight snare drum, you can control the sound pretty well. Another way to control the sound is what they call hot rods. They have drumsticks that are made up of a bunch of dowels that are wound together. And what that does is you still get the ping of the drumstick hitting the drum, but it's dissipated a little bit. So it softens the blow quite a bit. Another possibility is electronic drums, because you can completely change the volume of those. Drummers tend to hate them, but they are getting better. So for example, now they have drum sets, electronic drum sets, that have speakers in the seats, so you get a little bit of that kind of visceral feedback that you get when you're playing a drum, and you can kind of feel the thump of it. It's very hard for a drummer to play and not get that kind of feedback. It feels unnatural. So these sets are better. Or you can use hand percussion. A djembe, some shakers, tambourine, those kinds of things will work. Man, this is a whirlwind tour. We'll just keep plowing, then we'll take some questions. So for you as a leader, these are some important things. If you are leading the worship team, then you need to be thinking about these things. So musicianship is not just who is playing the music, but it's also who is preparing the music. So the first thing you need to do is you need to learn the song. I don't know how many times I've seen the leader of the band walk in and just have really no idea what they want out of the song. They know the song, as in they could recognize it, but they don't know the song, as in they could tell you, here's the chorus, here's the pre-chorus, they can't tell you any of those kinds of things. I think the best thing to do is approach it like a conductor. A conductor doesn't walk in to a rehearsal and say, so how do you think this should sound? Do you think this should be more happy or more sad? Is this a good tempo? They don't do that. They just say, okay, let's start at measure 20 and go. And they tell you exactly what they want. They tell you when it's right. They tell you when it's wrong. So learn the song very, very well. Prepare materials for musicians. Once again, people complain about their musicians not showing up on time and not being prepared, but then the leaders themselves, they don't have the sound system ready, they don't have the music ready, they don't have capo chords ready to go, they don't know how they want the song to go, on and on it goes. You can't expect your musicians to take it any more seriously than you do. So prepare the materials and have it ready to go, have it waiting for them, and that sends a very strong signal that we're here to work through this music. Rehearsing. During rehearsal, know what you want. So basically two sides of this. Know what you want and then work to get it. So I read a conducting book one time that I thought was really good, and it basically said, have the perfect performance in your ear, and then you just spend your rehearsal working to get as close as you can get to that perfect performance. So really, that's what your role is as a leader. And often leaders think that they're being overbearing by doing that. But once again, a conductor would not apologize, or not take a vote on the tempo of a particular song that they're doing. So it's okay if you're the leader. It's okay to go into the rehearsal knowing what you want and asking people to do that. You might have some power plays with someone who really actually wants to be the leader, and that's a specific issue that you might have. But generally speaking, if I show up as a bass player and the leader says, Greg, this is what I want this kind of groove, and I give that to them, they're open to discussion. They're open to, if I say, you know, well, how about this variation on that? They might say yes, they might say no, but at least I know what direction we're going. If they show up and they have no idea, we're going to spend a half an hour talking about how we feel about the song, and there's nothing more frustrating than being a musician, sitting around trying to gain consensus on the 8 songs that you're going to play on a Sunday morning. All right, so it's okay to lead if you're going to lead. Sound systems. Sound systems, we probably don't think much about sound systems when we're thinking about the music that we're going to do on a Sunday morning. But the reality is, if the sound system doesn't work, it doesn't matter what you rehearsed on Thursday night. It's going to sound bad. And we've all been in that situation where the sound person never brings up the lead vocalist's microphone, or has the guitarist so loud that no one can hear anything else. And that's a shame, because a lot of people have put a lot of really hard work into helping the congregation sing, and then it torpedoes all of their work. So understand that the sound mix can make or break the team's sound. It's really important. If at all possible, have the sound operator be part of the team. I am convinced that this is the way to go. Too often, the musicians come in on a Thursday or Wednesday, whenever they meet, they practice, they perfect everything, they show up on Sunday, and the sound operator just doesn't have the information they need to really do a good mix. It's better if the sound operator can be there during rehearsal, learn what songs they're doing, learn the quirks of each musician, and then be prepared to really do a great mix on Sunday morning. The sound system and the sound check should not be an afterthought. Once again, you know, I've seen worship teams, you've got vocalists me, and doing all the things that they do to warm up, and then it doesn't matter at all because their microphone never goes on. All right, so what we really want to do is on a Sunday morning before the service, we want to make sure we have a good sound check. Not a rushed sound check, but a sound check where everybody's comfortable with their monitor mix. They can hear themselves, they can hear the other musicians, the congregation's going to be able to hear what they need. It's not too loud, it's not too soft. And then everybody can just settle in and worship without having to worry about all of those things. Lastly, have a professional install the sound system. I don't know how many times I've experienced this, where the church tries to save a little bit of money, and Brother John says, well, I used to work at a disco, and I've set up speakers before, and just does a really bad job of setting it up. And so just put the money into it up front. It's a really important thing. And finally, skills for a lifetime. I am completely aware that 25 minutes of me telling you about worship teams is like me saying, here's how you play the organ. Pull those little round things and then wiggle your fingers, right? It's a little bit unrealistic. I completely understand this. My hope is that I'm giving you kind of opening a door, giving you a little introduction to some of these things. But this is a lifetime of learning for you. So here's what I would recommend if you are looking to lead worship teams and want to do it well, and want to be better at it 10 years from now than you are today. First thing is listen voraciously. Just listen, listen, listen. It is unrealistic if you are, for example, a classically trained musician. It's unrealistic for you to get better at leading worship teams if you don't listen to pop music. So listen to the best pop music that's out there. Listen to the Beatles, listen to Squeeze, whoever is out there. Listen to the radio, what's going on, both Christian and non-Christian. Find out, like, what are the great albums. I have a book called 1,000 Albums to Listen to Before You Die, and it just gives you 1,000 albums, jazz, rock, classical, and it will tell you, if you don't know the Beatles, here are the ones you want to listen to. Learn what instruments can do. Listen to people like Bruce Hornsby if you want to learn how to play the piano better. So just listen widely, broadly, and always don't just listen in the background, but hone in and say, this song makes me want to dance. How do they do that? How do they make that rhythm? What is the interplay between the bass and the drums that makes me want to move? What makes this song sound sad? What makes this song so rich or so sparse? Always listening, always evaluating in the exact same way you would do if you were an orchestrator. You would listen to symphonic pieces and say, is that an oboe that I hear there? So always listening. Learn instruments if you can. Learn some other instruments. So for instance, I learned how to play drums. I'm not particularly good, but I know how to do a drum beat. And so I know now better how to talk to a drummer. I know the basic vocabulary, fills and hits and those kinds of things. I can talk to a drummer, and that gives me both street cred. It also gives me the ability to communicate. Bring in clinicians. Often churches and church music directors feel like they are islands, and there are things like this from the CRC that are available to you, training sessions. I come in and do workshops and conferences. Those are really good opportunities. It's a great opportunity. If you have someone come in and work with your team, they might say the exact same things that you always do, but when it's an outside person, people go like, oh wow, that's really genius, which is a little bit frustrating if you're the actual director. But it's also good to know that the things are getting reinforced. They're going to hear it in a different way. And this is what builds your worship ministry over time, is everybody paying attention, everybody understanding that they want to get better at what they do. Because if you are going to do a ministry, then do it well. Do it as best as you can, because it's an offering to God. And read The Art of Worship. I know this sounds a little bit self-promotional, but the things that I'm talking about here, each of these things are unpacked in The Art of Worship. And so I think it's really a good idea if you've not led worship teams before, you just want to learn more about it. Get The Art of Worship. It's going to talk about all the things, how do you tune a guitar? How do they go together? A lot of things that I couldn't talk about today. How do you assemble a team? How many vocalists? All that. So feel free to go there. And now we come to our question time. And I think Diane is going to come back with questions, and I will let her do that.
You bet, Greg. Thanks for that very practical teaching. There was a lot there. You're right. And we do have a bunch of questions that have come in, but I'm first, while you catch your breath there a second, I'm going to read a couple of the chats that have come in. They're not necessarily questions in that format, but Adam said in the chat, and I think everybody can see this, but I'll read it anyway. One great thing about Planning Center Online is that you can load in multiple chord sheets for any given key. So you can have 2 chord sheets for the key of A, one in A and one in G. It's a great feature that he finds that it makes it way easier to prepare music for your teams. So that's connects with some of that talking when you're talking about transposing for your guitars and making sure your capos were, yeah, it was all set that way. So Planning Center Online, Adam finds very helpful. Another thing that he just agreed with you on basically was that you're right on the money with the people listening to somebody from the outside more than the internal voices. And there too, we would also recommend Greg. You can email him. We'll put up a slide at the very end with his contact information on, and you can call or contact Greg if you want him to come in and consult with your teams or do a session with your teams, and he does that as well. So I will start with the questions in the order that they came in. Jacob asked first, what do you think about taking into consideration the idea of creating something beautiful for the Lord as a band while also supporting congregational singing?
What do I think about that?
Yes, that's the question. What do you think about that? Creating something beautiful your band as a band.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where the question is coming from. At its very best, I think that church music can be both aesthetically beautiful and also practical. And I like to think about, arguably the best church musician ever, J.S. Bach. If you look at some of the cantatas, he has a real sense of what the congregation can do and what the musicians can do. And I think that what we want to be careful about, we want to give appropriately to the different roles. So the musicians show up and they practice and they have skills that they've honed over a lifetime. So they can do specialized things. but the congregation can't. So too often we have a really great band that kind of just shows up and plays, and they wow everybody with how beautiful things are. But if you look out in the congregation, no one's singing. They're all just listening, either because they can't take part or because it's kind of clear that we're here just to listen to the band play well. So I think that you have to balance that. You want to, everything that you do should be beautiful. It should be exciting. I mean, I always want to make it as interesting as possible. I want harmonies. I want guitar solos. I want all of these things to be there. But don't do it at the expense of the congregation. Always look to stabilize the congregation singing. And then once they are really stabilized and know what they're doing and can keep singing, the thing that you add is going to be exciting rather than confusing. So just keep that in mind as you try to do that beautiful thing.
All right, next question from Adam. Do you have any tips for encouraging piano players or organists who are used to playing solo to play in a band and use monitors? Any way to introduce them to the concept?
To the concept of monitors, that's interesting. I think a lot of people have trouble with monitors. I'll just tackle that real quickly. It's a very weird thing. You're used to hearing your voice come out of your mouth, and then suddenly your voice is coming from down at your feet, and that can be a very disconcerting thing. But just like anything, you get used to it after a while. I have had this conversation, especially classical musicians, over and over and over again. You know, there are musicians that feel that the grand piano is perfectly sculpted for the congregation and couldn't be better. And if you put a microphone in it, it ruins everything. And I appreciate the impulse, but I also have been in those congregations. And if you're on the other side of the congregation, you just can't hear the piano, especially if there are multiple instruments playing. So I think we have to slowly teach our classically trained musicians that technology is okay. Try to go easy on them. It does, you know, don't give your organist an in-ear monitor, but you know that we do use technology. In terms of getting them to play with a band, a lot of this takes practice. A lot of it takes dedication. You know, if your musician is kicking and screaming, they might never play because they don't want to play. And those are some interpersonal relationships that I wish I could solve easily over video, but they usually take time. But usually how I do this is I ask them questions point blank. You know, I will just ask, you know, say that I had an organist I worked with one time, very fine organist, and I would ask her to play with the praise team. You know, I'd say, when we come into the chorus, can you play the chords on this? And she'd say, I don't know how. And I didn't want to insult her, but I'm thinking, all right, you've played the organ for 40 years. You've taught organ and music theory. Certainly you can play those chords. You know what a C chord is, right? And but really what it was is she was uncomfortable. It was out of her comfort zone. And so those are the kinds of conversations where you say, are you giving me a hard time because you don't want to? Because you feel that you'll fail? You know, what's going on in the background here? And then let's have a conversation about that. Then we can address those issues, because if you are willing to work with me, it might take some failing to get better at it, but if you're willing to work with me, then we can make this work and we can get better over time. But we just have to have that communication going. So I think a lot of it is just that communication, getting to the core of why is this person not doing this thing. Sometimes it's just a matter of lack of skill, and that's another thing entirely. Sometimes you can show that person what you want. I have been known to lay a ruler across the bottom end of a piano so that they can't play the low end of the keys. I'm a jerk like that.
As a piano player, I would find that frustrating, yes. Okay, we have a lot of questions coming in, so here we go. Adam has a few more, but we're going to skip to one that Carmen has just asked. How do you handle a sound operator who attends rehearsal but doesn't have a good sense of balance?
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness. One thing you can do is you can bring in a professional sound operator. for a couple sessions. A lot of sound operators work independently. They might work with a company during the week, but you can often get them to come in on a Sunday or on a Wednesday evening or something like that. And if you're going to pay $10,000 for a sound system, which you likely are, it's worth bringing in somebody for $100 for a couple weeks to train your sound operators. So I tend to say for volunteers, I invest money in them. Like I might say, there's a sound technology in worship conference. I want to send you to that. Here's a book. Here's a great video that I found. And I just start feeding them things. If they're unresponsive to that, because some people just say, I don't want to learn, then you might need to start looking for a different sound person. I mean, once again, that's the conversation you have. You have to say, are you willing to get better at this? I want you to do this, but I really need it to be better. And how can we help you do that?
Yeah, good advice. Okay, Seth is asking, can you give us a few songs that you think every church should be singing?
Woof! Every church should be singing. Well, certainly they should all be singing my songs.
Yeah, of course.
That's a great question. I think one that I would recommend that has worked really, really well is Come Holy Ghost, which is also called Be Not Afraid. I think that's a great one. I like, I'll just name some that I do a lot of. Kwake Yesu, Here on Jesus Christ I'll Stand. That's one that sings really, really well. I like the Arabic Lord's Prayer. I know that those two are world music. I really like What the Lord Has Done in Me. I use that in a baptism sequence. So I'm kind of particular. I mean, I think that Lift Up Your Hearts is a really good starting place, and then you can branch out depending on what you use more of. If you use more contemporary things, more world things, more folk things. If that person wants to email me, I might be able to get them a list that's a little bit less off the cuff.
All right, great. And we'll put up your email address at the end on the last slide. So I'm sure they will probably do that. Debbie is asking, how do you handle the prima donna vocalists who keep trying to run the rehearsals when you've come with the plan as a leader?
Give them a knuckle sandwich. Yeah, it's, actually in my new book, Essential Worship, I talk a little bit about that because that's just the sad fact of the matter is that there are an unfortunate amount of power plays that go on in churches. You just think to yourself, you know what? If you want power struggles, why don't you go into politics? But like, why do you come to worship team rehearsal to duke it out with me? I don't have a ton of patience for that. If you are the duly appointed leader of that team, I think it is fully within your right, and it's actually your job to lead that rehearsal. And the person that will not submit to that, I think that it's really a submission problem, all right, which is a spiritual problem. And in Essential Worship, the new book, I talk about, taking that person aside or just asking them a pointed question like, when you ask a question like that, it appears that you don't trust my leadership. Is that what you're trying to communicate? And just say that. If they challenge you in the middle of rehearsal, you just say, essentially, are you challenging my leadership? Do we need to talk about this at another time? Or is this just, am I misinterpreting the tone of your voice? Often when you're playing with them, if they're being passive aggressive and you're playing with them and forthright, they back down and they realize, oh, I was kind of being a jerk. They might not, and it might need to go to the next level. You might need to have a conversation with the pastor or the elders or something like that. But I think it's a serious problem, and it's not just a problem between you and that person. It's a problem for the whole team, because basically the whole team sits there and watches you have this power struggle, and it's no fun for anybody. So take care of it, as uncomfortable as it is.
Good advice. Melissa asks, can you talk more about getting the perfect performance in your ear? My team will never sound like most of the mainstream recordings out there. Not bagging on them, but we don't have an electric guitar. Our bassist can only make it twice a month. Our vocalist can't do harmonies, etc. I send out recordings to my team, but sometimes they get discouraged, or gun shy because the recording is so unattainable.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, the recording might have a rock and acoustic solo that's not possible for my guitarist.
Yep.
So how do I strive for my team's best and still work with the talent that I have?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that is, it's very important that we're realistic on that. And I have mixed feelings about sending out recordings because the recordings are so slick. I mean, these are all Nashville musicians that are professionals, and so it's unrealistic for them to attain that. And I think it's kind of like clothing, all right? You might not be a model, but you can do your best to look good, right? And to beat yourself up because you're not the best looking person and don't have the best clothes, it's not helpful to anybody. But you can do small things that make you look better. And it's the same thing with your worship team. I think that, keeping the illustration of the model, you send out a picture of the airbrushed model and you say, why don't you look like that on Sunday morning? Well, everybody's going to just throw up their hands and say, oh, yeah, that was 30 years ago. So you have to make a decision about sending out those recordings. Maybe you should, but maybe you should look for live recordings from churches. Send out the studio recording that sounds great and unattainable, and then send out a YouTube link where it sounds just horrible. And you say, I think we can go right about in the middle here. And then be clear with your musicians what you expect. If your guitarist can't do that solo, just make a point of saying up front, I don't expect that solo. But try to get a realistic sense of what can my group do? What would a perfect performance by my group be? And how do I bring them as close as possible to that? So it's a tough line to walk there.
All right. Do you have any thoughts on using a cajon in worship, only a cajon in worship setting rather than a full drum set?
I have opinions on everything.
Well, good.
This is your lucky day, inquirer. I think cajones are fine. The one thing that I don't like about cajones is that if your player isn't really good, then you can't hear. The cajon is supposed to imitate a drum set. So you're supposed to get like boom, 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 boom. But what ends up happening is you get and it doesn't really push forward the sound of the group. And the same thing is true of a djembe. The djembe played poorly. It just sounds like a series of hits. I have seen one thing that I'll tell you about that I think is pretty good. There is a cajon drum pedal. It's basically you sit on the cajon and the pedal goes backwards to thump on the bass end of the cajon. So you get a real distinct kind of bass sound on that you don't get as much with your hand. And then so I've seen a person playing with brushes on the cajon, brushes and hands, and then that bass pedal. And that did quite a good job of clarifying the sound. So I'm not against it. I just think you have to be careful that it could be just adding a lot of mush to your mix.
All right, good. We have quite a few more questions, so we're just going to keep working through these here.
Right.
I know we might have to have a whole nother webinar to get everybody's answers in here. Seth is asking, it seems like congregations will be more willing to sing if the music is loud, but I feel like they will become better singers when the music is soft or when they sing a cappella. What are your thoughts on that?
All right. A congregation's voice is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised. And I think that there are two ways that you can go here that could be bad. The assumption that louder music leads a congregation better, I think, should be questioned. I think a full sound is good. And it really depends on, when you say loud, what you're talking. I've talked to congregations that I think it was 90 decibels that they were running their sound system at. It was just really loud. It was rock concert loud. The only thing you're going to do when it's that loud is scream against it. You're not going to sing. So I think that's unrealistic. I think that needs to be dialed back. I think a good full sound is fine. A good mix can go a long way toward that. just like an organ registering the pipes so that they cradle the sound of the congregation rather than overwhelming it. I think that that's important. What I would encourage you to do, what I try to do in every single service that I lead, is have some section that is sung a cappella. Now, if you're in a big band setting, you lead up to the repeat of the chorus, and then boom, the whole band cuts out, and the congregation's singing. There's going to be a moment where it dips down, where they're confused what's going on, and then they like, we can do this, yes! And then they sing it a cappella, the band comes back in. In a less modern setting, you could just do a verse of a song completely a cappella. And I think that's very important for the congregation. So always be looking for those places to exercise the muscle of the congregation's voice.
All right, great. Have you ever had a situation where some musicians complain about their prescribed part being too boring?
No. And mostly because, so with the instruments that I'm talking about, that I talked about today, bass, drums, piano, guitar, if the song is boring, they might find it boring. But generally speaking, a good musician finds ways to make their part interesting, because it's not really prescribed. I mean, I guess if you were asking someone to play, well, so for example, in Lift Up Your Hearts, some of the piano arrangements are very, very simple. They're meant to be simple. If you force your pianist to play those, then maybe that would be a problem. And if the pianist complains, you might say, okay, we'll embellish a little bit more. But then you're also free to say, no, not that low, not that high, not that busy, whatever. So I think it's kind of a dance between those things.
Okay, great. We only have a couple more questions so far in the queue. What do you suggest is the best method to introduce a new song to the congregation?
Great question. First of all, don't introduce a new song every week. I mean, I'm one that writes new songs, so I'm all for new songs. And if I had my druthers, I would just do all new songs. But I also realize that's not very pastoral. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they went to church, and the leader introduced 3 new songs in one service. And at that point, it just becomes a teaching session. All right? It's no longer worship. In my new book, Essential Worship, I talk about the balance between heart songs, songs that are kind of midway, and then songs that are very difficult. And how do you balance those kinds of things? If you're doing any more than one new song a week, and even that's pushing it, you're doing too much. So be careful about how much you do. I usually, when I want to introduce a song for real, I will introduce it as a prelude or as a special song, so the congregation doesn't have to do anything. And then I just usually have a system of, I sing the verse, I sing the chorus, I sing the next verse, and then I invite them to sing the second chorus. So hand it off to them when you feel that they can succeed. There's no point of not giving people music and asking them to sing with you on the verse of a song they've never heard. It's impossible for them. Sing it for them, have them sing it back. Don't stop the song, just keep it going. But in a real natural way, invite them to sing when you know that you've given them enough information for them to be successful. That builds the trust between a worship leader and the congregation.
Yeah, good advice. Okay, we're really close to the end of our time here, but I'm going to ask you one more question before we close. And then other people, if you have more questions to ask Greg, you can email them to us, and we can have him answer, and we can put it online when we post this webinar if you'd like. But for this session, the last question we'll take is from Jamie. And the question is, do you have resources or advice for how to communicate rhythms you want from the drummer?
From the or to the drummer?
Yeah, how would you communicate to the drummer what kind of rhythms you want for this particular song?
So there are a couple things you need to do. One, if you're listening voraciously, one of the things that does is it gives you a catalog of rhythms. So this is used all the time in pop music. If you're mixing a song, you say, I want this to sound like Metallica. And so what you do is you say to that person, that drum beat on that song by Rihanna, I want it to sound like that. Just simple, but in the groove, right? And then your drummer is going to go, oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Or describe a style. I want a Motown sound. This is just kind of a light waltz. This is good. Think more jazz than funk, right? Or you say, I want doom, doom, doom. And that's not hard for a musician to do. We've all heard those beats. So drummers speak the language of boom, 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 check. So just a boom chick is going to get you, even if you can't do fancy stuff, if you want, so listen to this. I go, boom, chip, boom, chip, boom, chip, boom, chip, boom, chip, boom. My drummer automatically knows it's country. But if I go boom, boom, chip, boom, boom, chip, they say, okay, it's more of a rock funk thing. And it's just as simple as that. So that's, you know, communicate in those ways. And then you can say things like a little less busy, some more fills, you know, those kinds of things.
All right, great. Thanks, Greg. I'm going to share my closing screen here now with everybody, and then we will, that's not the right one. There is the information that I was going to put up. Thanks for sharing your wisdom and your experiences with us, Greg. It's been great. If anybody does have more questions to ask, please email them to us, and we will get them to Greg and put the answers in writing online when we post this webinar next week. You'll see our email address and our Worship Ministries website address there. That's where we'll be posting the website or the webinar. And like I told you before, if you signed up for this webinar, you will be receiving an email as well that gives you the link to the webinar so that you can watch it again and share it with others that you think would need to see it. Also on this closing slide is information about Greg's books that he's talked about tonight. Most of his information was from The Art of Worship. That's by Baker Books, published in 2006, and his most recent book, Essential Worship, a handbook for leaders, is just out too last fall from Baker Books, 2016. And you might also find it interesting that our last webinar was led by Dr. Eric Mathis from Samford University, from the Anima Creative Arts program. And he recommended Greg's books to be used as you mentor young people, that you may want to go through one of these books with a young person that you're training for worship leadership. So they're really good for that too. Greg's website is there and his email address as well, so that you can email him if you would like to contact him about consulting with your church and doing something special to help you and your worship teams and your worship. So we are thankful that you've come and been with us tonight. We just thank you again, Greg, for being with us. And we hope that all that you've learned tonight, you'll be able to apply in your worship teams. So thank you and good night. And God bless you as you worship and lead worship in your churches. Goodbye.